Geno Smith did not write back. Geno Smith pulled off one of the most improbable, shocking career revivals we have ever seen. He came into the league in 2013 and was a starter for 2 seasons and didn't take over as full-time starter again for nearly a decade. He was a backup and an afterthought, and he even spent 3 years in Seattle before he ever got the starting job after Russell Wilson was traded. And then Geno Smith balled out. He played great, shocked the league, and earned himself a nice new 3-year, $105 million deal. I don't know how you can't be absolutely pumped for Geno and his absolute roller coaster of a career. But to truly understand his story, we have to go back to the beginning. Geno Smith was born on October 10th, 1990 in Florida and attended Miramar High School. During his high school career, he was a first-team All-State selection and was really good enough to earn himself a scholarship to play at West Virginia. Geno Smith was consistently good from 2009 to 2012 and was one of the top quarterbacks in college football. He didn't see too much playtime as a freshman. He only saw the field in 5 games and he threw less than 50 passes. Smith's sophomore year in 2010 was his first as a starting quarterback at West Virginia. That season, he started in all 13 games, completing 64.8% of his passes for 2,763 yards and 24 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. He also rushed for 217 yards and 4 touchdowns. Smith showed a lot of promise, leading the Mountaineers to a 9-4 record and a victory over NC State in the Champs Sports Bowl. As a junior, Geno threw for 4,385 yards and 31 touchdowns with only 7 interceptions. He also rushed for 151 yards and 2 touchdowns. Smith led the Mountaineers to a 10-3 record and a victory over Clemson in the Orange Bowl. In that game, Geno put on a show, passing for a record-breaking 401 yards and 6 touchdowns, earning him the game's most valuable player. Smith's senior year in 2012 was likely his best. He threw for 4,200 yards and 42 touchdowns with only 6 interceptions. He ended up leading the nation in touchdown passes, and he was a finalist for the Heisman Trophy. He threw for over 300 yards in 9 of the 13 games he played in. Smith was good, but the Mountaineers did still struggle. They finished 7-6, and they lost to Syracuse in the Pinstripe Bowl. Geno finished his career at West Virginia with 11,662 passing yards, 98 touchdowns, and only 21 interceptions, while also rushing for 342 yards and 4 touchdowns. After a very impressive college career, Geno Smith was drafted by the New York Jets in the 2nd round of the 2013 NFL Draft. His rookie year, he played in all 16 games and started in 8 of them. He completed 55.8% of his passes for 3,000 yards with 12 touchdowns and 21 interceptions, plus 400 yards and 6 touchdowns rushing. The Jets had a pretty tough season in 2013, finishing 8-8. Geno Smith was inconsistent, but he did have some moments. He had a standout game in Week 5 against the Falcons, where he threw for 199 yards and 3 touchdowns, while also rushing for another touchdown. Geno Smith started in all 16 games during the 2014 season, completing almost 60% of his passes for 2,525 yards with 13 touchdowns and 13 interceptions, plus 1 rushing touchdown. The Jets had another disappointing season in 2014, finishing with a 4-12 record. Geno did end up with some solid games, including a Week 10 win over the Steelers, where he had 200 yards and 1 touchdown while rushing for another. Then in 2015, everything did start going downhill. Geno suffered a preseason injury, which kept him out for most of the year. He only ended up playing in 1 game, and he passed for just 265 yards with 2 touchdowns and an interception. The Jets had a surprising turnaround the following season in 2015, finishing with a 10-6 record and narrowly missing the playoffs. Ryan Fitzpatrick ended up taking over as the starter, and he ended up just having a career year. He threw for 4,000 yards almost and 31 touchdowns, and that left Geno Smith on the sideline fine to just watch. In 2016, Geno Smith played in only one game as the backup and threw a touchdown and an interception. Then the Jets just had a disastrous season in 2016, finishing with a 5-11 record. Fitzpatrick struggled, and he was actually eventually benched in favor of Bryce Petty and Christian Hackenberg. Smith did not see much playing time and ended up becoming a free agent at the end of the season. Geno Smith signed with the New York Giants in 2017 as a backup quarterback to Eli Manning. He only played in 2 games, completing 21 passes for 212 yards with 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. Manning started all 16 games, and Smith didn't have much of a role at all. He then signed with the Chargers in 2018 as the backup to Phillip Rivers. He played in only 1 game and just had 1 pass for 8 yards. Rivers had a strong season and didn't miss any games, so again, little to no role for Geno. Things all changed for Geno Smith once he landed with the Seahawks. He signed with them in 2019 to be the backup to Russell Wilson. Wilson ended up having another strong season, and he didn't miss any games, so Smith never saw the field. Geno ended up re-signing with Seattle for 2020. He played in only 1 game, completing just 4 passes, but then Smith again re-signed for a season in 2021, and this time he actually got playtime after Russell Wilson landed on injured reserve with a finger injury in Week 5. Wilson did eventually come back in Week 10, but that gave Geno Smith some time to start for the first time since 2017, and he ended up playing pretty well. He passed for 700 yards and 5 touchdowns to only 1 interception while completing 68.4% of his passes. Clearly, the Seahawks had some faith in him because they re-signed him again. Last offseason, the Seahawks traded Russell Wilson to the Broncos. That left a big hole for Geno Smith to maybe step into the starting role, but in that trade, Drew Lock also came over from Denver. He was younger and a former second-round pick, so it made sense that the Seahawks maybe wanted to see what he had. But instead, Geno Smith won the quarterback competition and took over as the starter, and suddenly he looked elite. In Week 1, Seattle had to play Denver and Russell Wilson, and Geno ended up throwing for almost 200 yards and 2 touchdowns while completing 23 of 28 passes in a win. Not many people expected Seattle to outplay Denver, but the Seahawks in general were much better than expected. And to be fair, the Broncos were way worse. Geno ended up being named NFC Offensive Player of the Week 3 weeks later after a 48-45 shootout win against the Lions. He ended up passing for 320 yards, 2 touchdowns, rushed for almost 50 yards, and had a rushing touchdown. Geno was playing great football. He did cool off a bit down the stretch, but the Seahawks were in contention for the playoffs, and it ended up coming down to Week 18. Seattle ended up barely escaping the pretty bad Rams 19-16 in overtime, and with the Packers loss to Detroit, the Seahawks made the postseason. Geno Smith had a career best season by a ton. 4,282 yards, 30 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions while completing a league-leading 69.8% of his passes. That did ultimately lead to Geno Smith being named the Comeback Player of the Year and getting a 3-year, $75 million extension. What Geno Smith accomplished is wildly impressive. He really did go from a guy who was seen nothing more than a solid backup. Now he earned a nice extension. I will say, I don't think Geno Smith is the long-term solution for the Seahawks at quarterback. Seattle has the 5th pick at the 2023 draft, and I do expect it to be on a quarterback. I think it could be a hot spot for Anthony Richardson or Will Levis, depending on how the rest of the draft plays out. They may both need some time to develop, and who better to learn from than a guy like Geno Smith? He's been around the league, he knows what it takes to stick around, and of course, he's fought through a hell of a lot of adversity.